Willie. Hello, IT support.
Okay, are we all set here? All right. Well, excellent. This is perfect. We are right on time. I scheduled us to start at about 2:02 p.m. because I figured it'd take folks a couple of minutes to get settled in. So I'm very proud of myself for that one. I'd like to welcome you all to the third in a series of panels on environmental justice, cumulative impacts, and environmental decision making. Today's session is going to build on Monday's session where they went over the definitions of cumulative impacts and helping us to get a better understanding of how we measure them in a systematic way. And then that was followed up on Tuesday with the discussions of lessons learned at the state and local government level. I believe you all had some folks here from the Maryland state to talk about what they've been able to achieve there. And so today we're going to continue on in that same vein, and we're going to talk about some of the legislative barriers and opportunities to creating policy in a framework that is built on community involvement and takes into consideration root causes. But before we jump into all of that, let me take a step back and introduce our panelists. We have with you, as some of you already know in the room, Ms. Raya Salter. She's an attorney, consultant, educator, and clean energy law and policy expert with a focus on energy and climate justice. She is the founder of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center and a member of the New York State Climate Action Council. This is the body that developed the New York's plan to implement its nation-leading climate law. We also have with us today Mr. Willie Scott. He's currently the Environmental Committee Vice Chair of the Sierra Club in Delaware. In this and his previous role, he's worked to increase awareness of environmental justice with a particular focus on how permitting can be rethought to consider the cumulative emissions impact of all facilities within a community. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Maria Lopez Nunez. She has more than 10 years of experience as a facilitator who specializes in conflict resolution, racial and gender justice, and community building. She currently serves as the Deputy Director for Organization and Advocacy for the Ironbound Community Corporation. And in 2021, she was selected for the inaugural White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. So I'm going to start us off with a Cedar question to get us thinking about this. And I'm really curious, and we'll start with on my left, Mr. Scott, and just go through all of the panelists. Where in the legislative process should we be focusing our efforts so that we can actually create frameworks that monitor and evaluate cumulative impacts? And what I mean by that is we are all very aware that this is something that spans across all areas of government, right? This isn't just a Department of Energy thing. This isn't just changing laws and policies. This isn't just Food and Drug Administration or even defense to some extent. This is something that goes across the board. So when we're thinking from a community aspect of how we begin to build this out, where should we be targeting our efforts in the legislative process so that we can actually start to build a monitoring framework to address this issue? So Mr. Scott, can you start us off on that thought?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to participate. I think this will be a great forum. There's probably been a lot said already. As you mentioned, CI has been a topic, for the first couple of days of the session, and so I'm sure people have been deeply immersed if they participated in some of those sessions in this whole topic. And I think one of the things that should be considered is, when you step back and you look at cumulative impact, I'll keep calling it CI because it's easier for me to say CI than it is cumulative impacts. It's a pretty broad topic, and there are a lot of definitions out there, and those definitions include a lot of different causal factors, if you want to put it that way. They range from environmental factors in terms of exposure to emissions, as well as several socioeconomic factors. So if you step back and look at the whole topic of cumulative impacts, it's pretty broad. So when you think about, how do I address this, or how can we address this in a given community? I think you have to consider the root causes for the conditions that exist in each community. So each community is a little bit different in terms of what exposures there are and ambient air quality and a variety of factors. So again, I think it's stepping back to look at, what are the root causes for the key concerns you have in a given community. For us here in Delaware, the key issue was that we have this issue with polluting industries or facilities and people occupying the same space. And so you can think about, what that looks like and to create the issues that create. Some of those are legacy issues, from, historical practices, but we see those practices continuing on, with new permitting and new legislation, or I should say new permitting to allow more industry growth as a source of revenue for the state. And naturally, people talk about jobs. But if you think about Delaware, if you look at Delaware in the northern part of the state, it's pretty industrial based. And so, those are the issues we have to confront when we have this concern about people in the industry living in the same space. If you go down to the southern part of the state, it's a totally different deal. It's mostly agricultural, dominated by the poultry industry and capitals of concentrated animal feeding operations. So again, the circumstance there is a little bit different. So again, it gets back to this point of having to consider, what are the key issues, key concerns that we see in terms of people being overburdened with disproportionate levels of pollution. What are those sources, and how can you best mitigate those, in some reasonable fashion? So we've tried to focus on reducing emissions by limiting expansion and the growth of facilities, of polluting facilities in these communities that are already overburdened. And that's been our primary focus. There are two basic controls there that we can play with. One being thinking about land use and zoning and how that plays in these circumstances. And the other one being on the environmental permitting process. So to me, those are the two key knobs that are turned that determine, what level of continued exposure or future exposure people might have in these communities. And so for us, we chose to work on the environmental permitting side. Need to work on both, but we thought we'd get the most immediate effect and impact from working on permitting processes and practices. And the intent there is to try to limit emissions from existing facilities, create a basis for controlling emissions from expansions that may be on the forefront, and any new facilities that may look to come into our already overburdened communities, and also to have a greater level of community engagement and involvement in the decision-making process. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I think about it, but it basically comes down to, like I said, CI is like an elephant, and the old thing of how do you eat an elephant? Well, it's one bite at a time. And I think, it's critical for us to kind of step back and think, how do you divide and conquer this elephant and ensure that the actions we take are effective, immediate, and do produce long-term results.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Raya, as our lawyer on the panel, I'm very curious as to where do you think we should be starting in this legislative process to address cumulative impacts?
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Willie. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with Maria. We're really talking about some of our real champions on these issues, and I'm glad to be here talking about this. And, I was listening to Willie's comments, and it's just really important because in many ways in New York State, like we've kind of taken some leadership in terms of having some of these things in our law. We have a really broad, no disproportionate burden to disadvantaged communities mandate. We have, a whole process that had like a climate justice working group that really engaged leadership on identifying who is disadvantaged communities and all these other pieces. We also have a cumulative impacts law, which actually has some real problems because its effective date kind of grandfathers in a lot of the cumulative impacts. And we're at this place where we do need to focus on, it's like, it's enforcement. A lot of the things that we put forward when we do get these things in law, and I think we need cumulative impacts legislation. We need, climate acts that include justice and environmental justice and energy justice in addition to just, clean energy standards. But where I think we're coming up is compromises that get made, political rollbacks that we constantly need to fight. And also, really important, we're needing to come forward with more policy where the rubber hits the road. So exactly what Willie's saying, and I'm hoping I can learn from folks who've been digging into the weeds here, because then the state looks at us when they should be doing it themselves, but they look at us and say, well, what does this mean? What should we be doing to do a cumulative impact, analysis in this scenario, that scenario, this scenario? And we need to be coming forward with more detail on how to study this and how to actually implement this. And yes, how do we get to that local level when you're talking about permitting and zoning, which can be complex. Sometimes that's a municipal issue, a very local code issue. Sometimes it's state, sometimes it's overlapping state and federal. So it can be confusing. Municipalities need support. We need leadership from our state and federal governments on these issues. And to your point about legislation, I'll wrap it up to answer it. Yes, though, we do need these type of provisions in law on cumulative impacts, on justice more broadly, and on the structures that are going to create those opportunities for community participation. Like in New York State, we had our Climate Action Council, we had our Climate Justice Working Group. That was great, but New York State's very populous. We need more. We need to have more of these participatory bodies put through in legislation that give community members, community groups an actual voice in these processes. And there needs to be additional supports that facilitate that involvement by these by communities or organizations. So that's something else that we need to see more often in legislation.
No, thank you so much, Raya. I think that perfectly tees up Maria, who spent so much of her time in community. Oftentimes when we look at these legislative processes, they oftentimes happen in very closed door settings. I skipped my own introduction, but in a prior life before becoming a poor graduate student, I was a Capitol Hill staffer. And so I don't say this from an outside perspective. So many times you sort of find yourself in a last minute situation where you want to do the best you can and you don't actually have time to engage with the community. So I'm very curious, Maria, how should we be thinking about the legislative process differently so that the community isn't an afterthought, but they're actually a part of the process instead of having to be like, all right, here's a rule, now figure out how to make it work for you. Like, how do we have them be a part of that process?
Yeah, well, I think what was unique in New Jersey with our, nation leading law, the S232, is that it was born from the community. So it didn't come to us from our legislators, right? It's clear in New Jersey, especially in Ironbound, where, I work and live. You stand on a corner and you look around, you see 1, 2, 3. Oh, there's like 4 smokestacks, right? There are 4, currently 3, and we're fighting our 4th power plant in our neighborhood. We have a Superfund site. We have a garbage incinerator. We have the largest sewage waste treatment facility in our region, right? It accepts sewage from 12 different states. We're next to the longest Superfund site in the country, where Agent Orange and dioxin were just being dumped into the river. There's over 100 brownfield sites, and my neighborhood is only 4 square miles. So for us, I don't have to, it's not complicated, right? Like, I don't have to explain what cumulative impacts is. I just have to stand on the corner and smell, and it smells, I can taste how disgusting the air smells, right? I have to close my windows at night to get a good night's sleep because they don't make your head hurt. For us, when we brought the cumulative impacts law to our legislators, we didn't just bring it like we want this. We brought community support, right? Like community organizing. Well, in a lot of ways, we come with our own votes. And so if we're really going to show people how it's done, you have to show them your organizing power. It's not just like, oh, I have a good soapbox to stand on and talk to. Not like I actually got an audience, and at a moment's notice, I can mobilize hundreds of people. That's the power of working in community. Like for Ironbound Community Corporation, at the drop of a dime, I could have 300 people at your doorstep if we need to go there. Right? That helped us get the strongest law, where we didn't compromise. Even in the rulemaking process afterwards, we didn't compromise. For instance, one offering, they wanted to consider what's a compelling public interest to have an exception for the law, a loophole introduced, right? Obviously, we had to compromise on it, but what's good is we didn't have to compromise all the way. Like the unions and the governor's office, they wanted us to have an economic exception. What would an economic exception do but completely undermine the whole law, make it worthless, make it so that it would have been back to business as usual, where you could put a price on our community's health and well-being? Well, that economic exception was completely rebuked because at rulemaking hearings, we had hundreds of people showing up and knowing what they were talking about when they were arguing with the Department of Environmental Protection. I will also take just a different example. I agree. We need to follow legislatively, and it was important for us to get the cumulative impacts law. But it is incredibly important to pay attention to zoning. We were recently able to fight back a sludge plant because, when Dr. Ana Bautista was in my position, she used to work at ICC, right? Like 10 years ago, she was able to write into our master plan, no sludge processing facilities, and that was in the master plan. That's something we picked back up in 2022 when we're fighting a sludge plant. One day before the hearing, we realized, wait a second, this is not even an allowable use. And then we were able to take them back, have all the hearings we needed to kind of push that, like they're not an allowable use. And even if they get their permit from the state, they're not actually allowed to be on our land according to the city jurisdiction, right? So being able to fight the cumulative impacts fight at different levels is important. And that's what paying attention to both zoning and a legislative approach. I think that, Mr. Scott, you hit it right on the head. You need both of those, right? Because that's a hyper local. And then, of course, the state, because we're not going to get to federal yet until more municipalities and states start getting cumulative impacts law. That's the only way we're actually going to get it to EPA, because there's no work that starts at the federal level. Usually that work bubbles up from the ground up.
Yeah, so Maria, I want to push a little more to find out more about how you were able to get to a place where you could call 100 people or 300 people out of a drop of a dime to organize around an issue and be able to speak to it, in a way that not only they understood, but the people they were talking to understood. So could you walk us through a little bit that process of doing the education and the organizing so we can be thinking about how we incorporate that?
Absolutely. I mean, and to be clear, this is not an overnight, like, oh, do A, B, and C. Ironbound Community Corporation has been around for 54 years in our neighborhood, right? That is 54 years of having a presence, of people coming to us with their problems and us trying to figure it out, of how do we solve this together. So I don't want to act like, oh yeah, we all did this. Like, this is, a strong foundation that has been laid out for us by our elders and the community work that they've done in building that relationship of reliability and trust. For the rule, I mean, that's again, like, we weren't having a legislative process separate from our community advisory boards. They were kept up to date about what we were doing, the conversations that we were having, and what are the compromises that might be made, right? Like, we have to be real with our people too, that, like, we're not going to pass always the most idealistic law. We're going to tell them why we did something. Like, for instance, there was a choice between using disproportionality and just using increase. We went for the simpler one, right? We don't have to debate what is disproportionate. Is it disproportionate at twice? Does it have to be 4 times as much, 5 times? Like, that for us felt like a real slippery slope that then we're having a distractive fight. If we just said, if this increases pollution, it's an automatic rejection, that's something that I could talk to my people, and that actually is more enforceable than using the fancy language that we've become accustomed to. So, right, I think that there is an exercise of divorcing the way that academics, lawyers, legislators, there's like a whole vocabulary and language. We try to keep it simple. Like, we don't need no more smokestacks. We just don't need more shit. My part is for cursing, but that's just how it is. You have to keep it very realistic and grounded in the reality of what the community sees. Because I think one problem we have is that we act like policy so fancy that we can't talk to our community about it, or that we need to translate. It's actually like, people in this area need to stop making it so complicated. Like, it's almost self-justifying. And our community will tell you, like, that, that wouldn't work if you explained it to them. So being able to keep that discussion alive so that people feel a part of the policy making and can feel themselves reflected, right? Like, we try to keep away from all that jargon and keep it of, like, what's going to be the impact on your home and what do you want to see? So that we can also, as organizers, be held accountable by our own communities. We're not above accountability.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I will say, I don't think we have the NFL 3-second delay. So, thank you for being frank and honest. It's good for everyone. But but Mr. Scott, what she was just talking about brought me back to the conversation we were having in preparation for today's panel about not only being, open and frank with communities about what they can and can't get from this process, right? Because the legislative process isn't the only one, but when it comes to permitting, having it being shared, right? Not that, just the community has to just take on more emissions if they're going to have more economic success, and you can't see me doing air quotes here, but that also businesses and folks coming in have to share some responsibility and some pain, for lack of a better word, in this process. So can you talk a little bit more about what permitting looks like when it's not just based on an individual facility, but when it's looking at the cumulative impact of those emissions within the community?
Sure. So if you consider the current practice in Delaware, when someone applies for an environmental permit, that permit is assessed on a one-off basis. In other words, it doesn't take into consideration any other environmental factors that people are already subjected to. So there's no consideration given to the levels or the types of pollution that already exist in the community. They only look at that one application, that one facility, and what might be proposed to be emitted from that facility to make a determination as to whether or not this is an acceptable thing to do and it's okay to go forward with a permit. And so in contrast, what we would want to do when we think about cumulative impacts is to give consideration to what already exists in the community. So what facilities already exist that emit and expose people to toxic pollution, traffic, proximity to major roadways, which have historically been built either through or around, environmental justice communities. Is this in a congested urban setting? Are we subjected to, a bunch of distribution centers in that area where you've got diesel truck traffic coming in and out of the community? What's the ambient air quality level look like in that particular community? And Delaware also has a unique position of being a non-attainment area in our biggest county in the state, for ground level ozone, which we know, creates respiratory risk. So taking all those factors into consideration, in addition to this new thing you want to do, I think is what's critical. So it's not just a new thing by itself, but it's the new thing in addition to what already exists. And that should be, one of the primary bases for, saying yay or nay to an environmental permit. And it doesn't just apply to air quality. I mean, as I mentioned, when we get into the southern part of the state, we're talking about groundwater quality, nitrates and other chemicals that leach into the soil and eventually make it into the groundwater. So we've got issues with contaminated wells and that kind of thing. So again, it's, recognizing that already exists. And so when we look to increase the capacity of a poultry farm or, put in a new poultry farm, those factors have to be considered in addition to, what pollution this new thing might bring. And so that brings you back to, ensuring that you have a good cumulative impact analysis to make the determination of the health effects of, this proposed project in conjunction with, the factors that already exist and, helping us get to a point where we can understand when have we reached tilt, when it's enough too much or when we, how do you say no is the bottom line. And that needs to be critical, that health impact analysis. There's a lot of challenge around the science that's being used in health impact analyses. So it's important that, if you're going to do one of those, that it be done in a way that's credible and it's able to sustain challenge, because there will be challenge. And it needs to be performed by an objective force, having an objective source, I should say. Having the State Department of Environmental Control do that for you, probably not a good idea. So how do you engage outside consultants that are reputable and credible and providing, an objective analysis? Just wanted to echo something that Maria said a little while ago. I cannot overstate the significance of community engagement in developing these processes, whether it be legislative or regulatory. Again, as Maria said, a lot of this stuff gets convoluted. It's a lot of legalese. There's a lot of science, that people have to kind of digest and try to understand. A lot of statistical information that has to be absorbed. Like I said, we can kind of overwhelm people very quickly with not just nomenclature, but information and data. So it's important, number one, to ensure we've got good mechanisms to engage people, keep them aware, provide huge opportunities for input, into whatever proposal you're thinking about taking forward, and then keeping them up to speed on progress. And as Maria said, sometimes you get into these legislative issues and you do have to make, reconciliations, I'll put it that way. And again, it's finding the least deadly option, for the outcome that you're trying to reach. There are other issues that, I think we need to think about as we think about the permitting process. And so what does outreach look like from the Department of Natural Resources or whatever the environmental control agency is in your particular state? How do they communicate to people that there's this permit that's being proposed in your community? How do you do that in a way that, if language is a barrier, that's taken into consideration in those communications? What vehicles or medium do you use to communicate to people, and how is that done and on what frequency? How do you make sure that, hearings are accessible, and that people can actually come and engage and participate and hear about what's being proposed? In Delaware, we've got this deal where, our chief environmental officer can decide whether or not there'll be a public hearing. And one of the things we're looking at is that no, if you're going to have someone apply for a permit in an overburdened community or an EJ community, that public hearing should be mandatory. It shouldn't be something that slides out in a notice in the newspaper. People may see it and may not see it, and then the onus is on the community to request a hearing. It should be automatic that a hearing be held. There needs to be community oversight in the permit decision-making process. We get into a legal issue here, and that the agency is, got ultimate accountability for the decision. And we're not asking that, we have community members making the decision, but we want to make sure that they have input in that decision-making process and also an opportunity to challenge any decision that comes out of that. The other little thing we've got that plays in Delaware is the use of emissions offsets. And so I don't want to get too deep into emissions offsets, but it's basically a scheme that says that, if somebody requests a permit, there's going to be some level of emissions that they can't reduce on their own. They are allowed to buy credits at a fairly cheap price that were generated when somebody else, somewhere else in the state of Delaware, actually reduced emissions. And so the net effect of that is that that permit requester is allowed to increase emissions in the community where they're going to place a facility or expand a facility using an artificial offset. And that we think is just atrocious. So those are the kind of things I think that, again, as you go back and look at what happens, in your community, what are the key ills and issues, how do you address those in a way that, those can be at least mitigated, if not eliminated. So think about the flaws in your state and permitting processes. We talked a little bit about zoning, but as you look at the municipality level, what can you do to influence zoning as comprehensive plans are being developed that typically run about a 10-year cycle. What stamps can you put in those to ensure that like Maria described, there's some things that will help with this process. Not just on the permitting side, but just on the, can you even do this on this piece of land kind of thing. So this thing, we kind of model the legislation that we're proposing after the legislation that was done in New Jersey, S-232. That's when Maria and I had a chance to acquaint ourselves with each other. But as I said earlier, when you look at Jersey and you look at Delaware, they're apples and oranges, both fruit, okay, but different kinds of fruit. And some of the issues that were faced in New Jersey were not necessarily issues that we had in Delaware. And so we had to really think about, okay, the construct of what was done in Jersey, I think is a good fit and a good model for us, but how do we tailor that to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our state? This is not a quick or easy process, okay? It's easy for us to sit here and talk about this, but Maria, I think you guys worked over 8 years, or 7 or 8 years on S-232 when you get all the way through to the regulatory process. And we've been at it now for 3 years, and hopefully we'll be able to introduce our legislation in the next session early next year. So it's not a quick and easy process when you do all of the groundwork that needs to be done to get to the right place.
Yes,
Again, you got to have broad, deep levels of community involvement in developing, any legislative changes. So again, that people have an opportunity for input. What do you really want to see change? Some awareness of what the options are, for change, and then good alignment with the community on what you want to see going forward. And just to plug at the end here, the old saying is all politics are local. And so none of this is going to happen if you don't have the support of elected officials. And so as election seasons come around, I think it's imperative that, we understand who are these people that are running, what are their position and stances on these issues, particularly around the issue of permitting and cumulative impact. Are they willing to take a stand and support your efforts? And if you find one that is, fine, let's make sure that that person winds up in the right place. But then at the end of the day, you still have to hold them accountable, for their positions and ensure that they are supported. So it's a kind of convoluted process. It's all encompassing. It should be pretty much all encompassing as best you can. But again, think about those key factors of, what are the critical issues in my communities? What would be one of the few things that would make a difference, whether it be through permitting or zoning? And then how can you tailor that legislation so that, you address those issues? And the other one is to have a good partner in your General Assembly that can be a solid sponsor and has got the guts to take this thing forward. Because it's not an easy fight. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce is going to come at you. Businesses are going to come at you. Other General Assembly officials, will have their own thoughts about whether or not this is a good idea. So you really need to have someone that's got a really strong backbone and really passionate and committed to the cause to make this work.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Willie. You highlighted a number of things, but before we've got about 9 minutes or so left in the moderator questions. And I wanted to shift to Raya. Actually, was thinking about this because I know the legal process has gotten a little maligned, and so has the scientific process as an engineer, because we do like our big words, and sort of trying to really be very definitive in how we define things. And so I'm curious, in your work in this space, particularly in New York, where you have, I'm sure, a very engaged populace, how have you gone about the work of educating and preparing people to be involved in these legal processes, through your law center and other activities?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I actually wanted to speak again to, sort of like the issue of compromise and political power. Like, what we're trying to do, what I think the intent from like the New York's climate law, which was a activist-based, community-based climate law, is actually start changing the structures of government, changing the trajectory of harm that of both disinvestment in frontline communities and lack of participation and environmental harm, and actually get the government to start being an instrumentality and sort of trying to shift that. And just to one point, as many folks may know, the federal Justice 40 policy came from New York State's policy of 40% of the benefit to frontline of climate spending must go to frontline communities. It's just a question about the compromise. Like, we didn't want benefit. We didn't want that benefit standard. We had a lot of thoughts about what that should be. We thought in the first instance, it should be money spent, dollars spent. But just I mentioned that to how powerful these compromises can be, because when that policy was lifted to the federal level, you still ended up with that murky benefit standard. And these things are really problematic. But we have things in the law that like in New York, we're trying to get beyond, not beyond cumulative impacts, but beyond cumulative impact and the analysis needed. But our actions are supposed to prioritize emissions and co-pollutant reductions in frontline communities. So it's beyond like, no, you can't add. We're supposed to be starting from actually looking to a place where we're investing in improvements and making things better. But yes, to the points that folks are making here, none of that matters without the political pressure, without the community engagement. And certainly, the work I do is very much all about, literally, you have to go out in communities. And let's also, a dynamic we don't talk about enough is that, we have this incredible inequity in funding in the environmental, and climate movement. So when we're talking about frontline communities, Black and Brown and Latinx and low-income communities, folks often, we don't get the resources to actually do this outreach. Some of these bigger groups literally get hundreds of millions of dollars to get billboards. And so just, trying to level set an equity in terms of actually reaching out to folks, because in many places, you really are starting from zero. You're starting from jump. And I know that what we've done in my local area, just literally starting community organizing, community pop ed and engagement, starting from jump. And there's no, as Maria said, 50 years in, there's no shortcut, to actually just going, person to person, neighborhood to neighborhood, legislator to legislator, because a lot of our Black and Brown legislators, may or may not be engaged in these issues too. Many are, but many aren't. And so literally it's a question of making sure that folks, get communicated to about these issues and are asked to come in and participate. And then we have to put all kinds of pressure on the bodies, to do what they're supposed to do, which actually is complicated and frustrating. Ideally, ideally we can get to a place, and that's what we're trying to do, where we're actually, again, where we're putting these structures into the state law, so they can start turning the corner on perpetuating so much environmental injustice and harm. Another piece that I think that we really need to see is we need investment in community-based organizations to do this work, but states and federal governments need to do more investment in the science of how the science and the social science and the medical science of how this is supposed to work. For instance, in New York State, our state law, our climate justice law required air monitoring, piloting of air monitoring, so we can start to create a baseline in disadvantaged communities, or frontline communities is the term. We have a company called Aclima that is using cars with sensors that are going block by block in neighborhoods. I advocated for it to be in my local neighborhood. They are getting so much data about the sources of this pollution, so much data that it's almost causing some frustration or fear from the state, because we're actually starting to see the PM, the methane, where these sources are. So we need to start investing in how do we utilize that data. So that's one of the projects that my group is focused on, is community education programs around analyzing that data. This summer, we had a summer environmental justice learning camp, where the students learned how to look through that data of what's actually happening in their neighborhood. And we also, taught the students about, what is environmental justice? What is climate justice? Why are these things important? And so, that's work we can continue to do. But we need the government to do their part in terms of investing in the science, so they can stop turning it to me and saying, well, how am I supposed to analyze this? And it's like, you know what? You've got this data. You need to start analyzing it, and you need to invest in and our legislation needs to have budgets attached to it. That's something our CLCPA was a messaging bill. It had a lot of law in there. But now is what we're doing now is we're pushing for the actual funds and money that comes behind it. We got to have the funds to implement these laws, and they need to include laws to invest in this science, so that the state can start figuring out what cumulative impacts means.
Well, I think that's a really great point to sort of pull this all together as we get ready to turn to the audience for questions. Is the audience mic on? But thinking about not just getting the legislation done, because we often do have these things, right? I think about resolutions, or even if you get laws passed, and first it's getting laws passed that actually have markers and standards in them that have penalties attached. But even beyond that, right, to actually get those done, you need to have some sort of budgeting for it, because saying you just have the law and the policy, if there's no money behind it to actually enforce it and make it happen, it's almost worse than not having it, right? Because then in the future, people will come back and say, well, we had the law on the books. So thinking about that, thinking about all the discussions that we've had, I'd like to open the floor up now. If there's anyone with questions, I promise I can fill all the time up with more questions myself, but I'm going to try not to do that. So please, this mic here in the middle of the room. Don't be shy. Yes, ma'am. Please come to the mic so that they can hear you.
Hi. Can you try speaking very loudly? Thank you. Hi. Yeah. I'm Claudia Blanco, part of NRDC, and I just wanted to ask what have been the most effective ways that you've communicated and organized communities? And I guess this would be directed to Maria, but also just in general, wanting to ask what has been most effective for you.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear, so I'll repeat the question. We have a question from a young lady, Claudia Blanco, and she was asking Maria, what has been some of the most effective ways that you've been able to organize the community?
Effective. Dun dun dun. Yeah. For me, I think effective is like having a good, clear enemy, right? Like the sludge plant was so good. I mean, the sludge facility wanted to burn human waste, right? Like we have a sewage treatment facility, so they wanted to pipe it over and then just burn it in our community that already has all the stuff I talked about. So actually um the picture behind me is from the rally we had. Like we had this beautiful walk from our community center to the sewage waste treatment facility, and it's like a short walk, right? Like it's effective organizing when it's clear who the enemy is, the messaging is clear. It was stop, I won't repeat myself, but it's stop shitting on Newark, right? It was very clear, like there's human waste that they just want to burn in our neighborhood, and they're telling us it was actually a greenwashing thing. It was supposed to be considered carbon capture, right? It's beautiful how greenwashing works. And as we were challenging them about the fact that they're not in our zoning, they started shifting the vocabulary and calling it biosolids, right? Like there was no longer sludge. So like being able to capture that language and say, nah, it's sludge. You're just burning human waste, calling a pig, that made it really like exciting for the community to be a part of, because it really did really, I think, solidify that us versus them mentality. And then what happened to the elected officials? They had no choice but to get on board with us, right? Like they might have wanted to try to stay neutral, but it was kind of irresistible for them to join the side of the community. And it was the first time in my time at ICC, and I've been here for more than a decade, that I saw all the elected officials, like at every level, like all the council people, the mayor, the assembly people, the senator, right? Like the state senator, like everybody giving us their solidarity to say no to this sludge plant. I mean, they didn't do themselves favors. In the articles, they said we followed the feces to Newark, right? Like a facility that's that derogatory towards our community makes it easy to galvanize the folks. So then in terms of organizing, all we had to do was tell people the truth, like show them the articles, show them what they were doing, and that kind of got people really engaged and invested in the outcome. So I think great organizing is honestly, you have to have a good story. It has to be easy to follow and clear where the community if they participate, what's the difference that they can make? And in our case, we told them, like, we need to get our elected officials behind us or we're by ourselves, right? Because at the end of the day, we can stop construction, but we need people in power to actually care about us and hold them to their jobs. So the community saw that difference start to matter, right? Like that when they called all these offices, that folks were coming onto our side. If you're just telling people to galvanize and just be in the streets, that's not always the most strategic, right? Like it has to be leading to something, all the action, right? Like we had a rally, but it was a part of a strategy, a bigger strategy, media campaign against this facility and against the people that were not on our side yet. And eventually we were able to get everyone to our side. And I think that makes for also good organizing for the next time, because people remember the journey they took with you and if it was worth their time. So I always tell the organizers, we're not going to waste people's time. And we're not going to do things if we only have 4 people behind us. We need to make sure that we do have critical mass and we're not just doing things because we feel self-righteous about them.
That's true.
I think, yeah, that's it. All right. I think we have solved our in-room technical issues, so that mic should now work. Uh-oh.
Now it's on.
Ah.
Hi, I'm Dee Williams. I'm from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. My question is for Raya, and I'm just curious if you have included any kind of health outcome data that you're going to be collecting to show that some of the legislation and some of the EJ regulations that you've come up with are having positive and health co-benefits.
Are you? I'm hearing a couple. I'm hearing like this question is probably like, what is the state doing? Like the state of New York, and then also like what are we doing in our work to try and make sure that this happens? Maybe I'll take the question like that. I think the state, needs to do more. One of the things that it's just things just sort of like move so fast in the policy world and start doubling over like, on themselves, because the thing that we're grappling with right now in New York State is that post the the climate law and the climate plan, the state has decided they want to do a statewide cap and trade program. They're calling it cap and invest, but really it's cap and trade. And the idea, of course, is that, broadly is, they want to use this as a way to raise funds, to pay for clean energy programs and other things. But the, EJ advocates are very concerned about, what have traditionally been some really negative impacts in this area. And I mention it because in this context, we're now looking at, okay, are we going to be regulating these sources and ensuring that we're actually going to get the emissions and co-pollutant reductions, that we want to see, and how can we make sure that we prioritize these emissions and co-pollutant reductions in frontline communities? And frankly, again, this is why I think there's a lesson. It's like once you've got some of these great stuff in language in law, we need a lot of pressure on the government in terms of like, what do these analyses like really mean? And that is really the fight right now, is like, how do we hold them accountable to these standards? How do we demand that they engage with them, and they engage this data, to your point? And how can we have the actual indicators to hold them accountable to that? I will say that as part of the climate justice working group process that identified who is a quote unquote disadvantaged community in New York State, which is where these other pieces kick in terms of no disproportionate burden and cumulative impacts. The state did go through a very robust analysis to identify communities, and they did include a lot of health data to really get at how are communities both climate vulnerable and pollution burden. And so a lot of that data is there, a lot of it is public, but I'll just stop and say that yes, we need more accountability, we need more metrics and standards to hold government accountable, and that is the fight that we're in right now.
Thank you, Raya. Our next speaker.
Hi, I'm Terrence Bankston. I'm the Senior Ports and Freights Campaigner for Friends of the Earth. We are a national and international environmental organization.
I think they turned it back on.
Hi, I'm Terrence Bankston. I am the Senior Ports and Freights Campaigner for Friends of the Earth. We are a national and international nonprofit. Part of my role is, and we prioritize, I'll say that as well, the Mid-Atlantic region, the Southeast, and the Northwest. Hi, Maria Norkstrong. And but presently, we're working with DCBAC. Willie, you might be familiar with the coalition. I know Sierra is a part of that on their community benefits agreement in Delaware. But when I look at Delaware's port, Wilmington's port, when I look at Newark's, New York and New Jersey's port, and we talk about Justice 40, and we talk about the $3 billion in Green Ports funding through IRA, when we talk about the federal government prioritizing environmental justice communities, part of my concern as a resident of New Jersey, but also in my work, is that ports will leave funding on the table, this unprecedented amount of funding, this small time frame to sort of to create programs and access this funding. But this push to have collaboration and true engagement ongoing with with our environmental justice communities. The fact that ports are not aware, we just met with New York, New Jersey, that there's IRA funding, the government relations rep we met with, and sustainability. There's IRA funding to provide incentives for stakeholders in environmental justice to engage with the port. A lot of times our politicians are used as the front line for our voice, and we know, those of us who are on the front line of environmental justice movement, that we truly need to be the ones that are at the table. So in terms of regional successes and perhaps individual successes for greening our ports and encouraging these collaborations, what are your thoughts around how we can organize as environmental justice movement for the Mid-Atlantic to sort of see some successes and some growth between all ports, but also, again, regional successes? What are your thoughts around not just holding the ports accountable, but ensuring that we have a transformative partnership versus just a transactional partnership with our ports? And that's for, Delaware, New York, New Jersey, just any feedback you have on that.
Well, I'll answer for Delaware as best I can. You're right. Yeah, I'm aware of Delaware community. I'm sorry, Delaware community benefits agreement coalition that is operating in our state to deal with the port and the expansion of that port. And it again is one of those convoluted issues where the original or the recent port operator, I guess, basically went bankrupt, and now we've got a new port operator, and there's obviously a lot of incentive from the state to kind of recoup some of the losses and keep that port open and operating. So that kind of sits in the backdrop of all of the work that needs to be done to ensure that the actual operation of that port is sustainable and that it's not harmful to people that live around it. I think DBAC has done a lot of work, a lot of good work to try to bridge that coalition. But it's tough to do that when you got to change an operator and some of those dynamics you're working against. I think the other opportunity that exists, though, and the leader of DBAC and I talked about this a little bit, is that there's at least one or two other organizations that are concerned about what's happening, not just with the port, but with the river in general. There's been a lot of activity over the last several years in terms of fracking in Pennsylvania, and then the nat gas that comes off that, or the LNG, I should say, that comes out of that fracking process. There's been a lot of push to build terminals in Jersey, for transshipment or transloading and shipment of that material, the LNG, down the Delaware River. And so when we look at that particular issue, the effects on overburdened communities are the same as they are for the port, having cargo of LNG floating down the river, and we all know the potential hazards associated with that from a fire and explosion standpoint. And we're not talking about a huge river here, so there's a relative level of risk exposure. So I guess my point is, one opportunity I think we have is to broaden the coalition out beyond just the community benefits agreement coalition, and think about how we can leverage the energy, or the synergy, I should say, between the efforts of DBAC and those that are working to deal with this whole issue of fracking and the transport of natural gas down the river, and build an even stronger coalition. So I think that could be helpful, but it still comes back to getting some stability right now at the port, so that we can start to have those kind of conversations and dialogue, and help the new owner, who's relatively new to the industry as well, to understand what potential there is for support to do the things that the community is asking him to do, or asking them to do, I should say.
Well, thank you. Were there any other questions in the room? Well, I actually like to take that question and broaden it out to the entire panel, because I think you hit on a really important component there. As we're engaging in these processes, what are some things we should be thinking about? Sometimes you just need a transactional relationship, right? Like they need a thing, you need a thing. But if we're really trying to undo some of these long-term systemic issues, we do have to be thinking about transformative relationships. So I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panel before we go into closing thoughts about what do we need to be looking for, or how do we need to be engaging so that we can start to build some of those transformative relationships to accomplish some of the things that we talked about here today. We can start with you, Miss Maria.
Yeah, no problem. And definitely, I wanted to get Terence's question because it's a good one. I hope if anyone has the opportunity to intervene, do not let anything become a public-private partnership. That is just like the end. That is the most terrible structure I've come across in trying to. I think all private is better even than private public, because one hand washes the other, and that's the situation that we're in New York and New Jersey with our port authority. It is, and especially it's a public-private partnership between two states, right? So it is almost next to impossible. It has been for us to hold these entities accountable. And we've done a lot of work with Terrence, with Clean Water Action, with Southport Environmental Alliance, New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, right? We're together in a coalition for healthy ports. And, we fought the good fight, but the Bayonne Bridge has gone up. Our port is going to become bigger. And they are leaving money on the table for communities. They self-report, and what they always say to us is, you have to regulate me. And that feels, again, like an unfair ask of communities, right? When we're talking transformation, I want to see public-private partnerships end unless they have really stringent accountability measures. The city of Newark has no representation, no adequate representation in the decision-making body of the port. So it's hard. Like, who do you go to make sure that they even apply for money that they're eligible for? right? And so that's where we do oftentimes have to go and have political conversations. And I agree with the sentiment. Sometimes relationships are transactional. So I'm okay with that, with especially with elected officials sometimes, or bureaucrats. It is important to demonstrate what can we do for others. And I do know that communities can do a lot more than we're given credit for, right? We're not just, I think for me, it always comes to, I'm asking for your support, but I'm going to give you support to get it to the finish line. It's not just like, I want you to do this for us. We're also going to come in and we're going to push together behind you. And I think that when officials, whether they be elected or just government officials, see that, they realize, oh, I can actually do the right thing in my job, right? Because I also want to always have compassion for the fact that there is a lot of pressures we don't see behind the scenes on people that we hold on, sometimes on pedestals. They're just human trying to navigate through a lot of complexity themselves. So they do need our communities to have their back if they're doing the right thing, right? It is carrot and a stick when it comes to organizing. And I'd rather be behind someone and on their side than having to fight the people that are supposed to represent us. I want to have their back if they are willing to have our communities back. So I'll leave it there.
That is a whole lot of fantastic. I want to make a point that I think is really, really important on this community engagement thing. At the federal level and at the state level, we're starting to see governments use community engagement or community input as almost like a proxy for environmental justice. So and this is something like, this is like a no-go, like this idea that we're going to show up and talk and you're going to go ahead and do what you wanted to do anyway, and that you somehow absolved yourself of your responsibility to not create disproportionate burdens. The government is supposed to be out here fostering environmental justice. That's what they say they're going to do. Case in point, the federal power plant rules. Right? These federal rules, if you see that federal rule, which basically is creating a carbon capture standard for power plants across the United States. And they actually say in this rule that they know that emissions are not going to come down equally, and they're not going to come down specifically in frontline communities. They just out and out say it. And then what they spend a lot of time saying is, we're going to make sure that there is community engagement, that there is community input, that there's community engagement. So there's this idea that you can put in this idea that you're going to talk to or talk at communities or have communities talk at you. And but there needs to be that stick behind it. Like, we are doing this for a reason. This input is supposed to be meaningful, and that does not take the eye off the government to stop perpetuating environmental injustice.
Well, I think, you just said a word there. You got some mm-hms, and I felt maybe even a good low amen in the room. So I want to challenge us a little bit. As we are preparing to close out, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to prepare communities for engagement with various types of agencies and types of actions. But we all sit in different, agencies with access, whether that's to funding, whether that's to lobbyists, whether that's to community members, whether that's with access to legislators. And so I sort of want to, and even for the folks in the room, I want our final thought to be a little more focused on us and how we engage and go forward in this process. So just a reminder that it's about 3 minutes allotted for each final speaker's final thoughts on this. But I want you all to give some thoughts and insights on how do we change how we operate in our organization, so each of us from our spheres, so that it's easier for communities to have access and engagement, right? So we're doing less of that whitewashing of saying, hey, we're participating in community engagement. And this may not be about us as individuals. I think anybody at this conference is already here in that space of actively thinking about community engagement. But I also guarantee that we work with folks on a regular who are using those terms, but aren't really thinking about how they change their organizational structures to make it easier for communities to have access. So what are your thoughts around how we change how our organizations are working, our processes, so that it's easier for communities to have access? I'll start with you, Mr. Willie, and just a final reminder that there's 3 minutes allotted for each person's closing thoughts.
I'll try not to use the whole 3 minutes then. I think there are a couple of things that would be beneficial. One is just, how do we share success stories so that, there's greater awareness of what's possible, what's worked well, what were some of the key learnings that came out of that process or methodology, and, what can we learn from that? So just as knowledge becomes, as it becomes knowledge of, a success story in a given place or given space, how do we become, more conscious of what was done and why it worked well. So I think that would be critical. Sharing progress on relevant federal regulations and programs. I think each of us probably try to stay up to speed with, what's going on at the federal level and what that means. But again, that's a whole kettle of fish that, requires a lot of oversight and deep diving. So just having access to, what's going on at the federal level that may be of benefit, to us down at the local level. And then think about access to available resources that, you may have privy to. An example I'll use is as we were crafting this legislation for Delaware, Dr. Wilson made available to us some GIS mapping resources, which, were totally helpful in helping us put more definition around, what we meant by an overburdened community and ensuring that the way we had crafted that met the need. So whether it be GIS mapping, environmental health experts, et cetera, just being aware of who those resources might be and maybe having some limited access to them, I think would be beneficial in this whole effort.
Thank you. Miss Maria?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it simple. Don't be boring, right? Like if it's gonna be engaging, it can't be boring. And I've seen I've sat in community presentations where I'm like, damn, I know this is important, but I'm having trouble staying awake, right? Like I think we need to be a lot more self-aware if we're gonna be engaging our communities. And that might mean changing everything in our organization to be relatable, to be fun, to be inspirational, right? Like sometimes we have like the beatdown message of, oh, it's all bad and we're just victims. Like we cannot sell victim mentality. We need to sell agency to our communities of how they can see themselves as their own superheroes. Like, because our communities don't need nobody to save us. They haven't been. And I'm not waiting for the rescue. Like in our community, it's all about like what we can do for ourselves and how we can exert our power that has been taken from us, but we have to take it back. No one's going to hand it back to us, right? So that has to be an inspirational, a fun message. It can't be boring and it can't make you feel like you don't belong in the room. If it feels like I need a certain degree to be inside this room, then you've left me out, right? It shouldn't feel so exclusionary. And I think sometimes the more in policy we get, the more we do that, even if we don't mean to. So we got to just keep checking ourselves. How do we sound, and do we still sound relevant to the communities that we serve? Because they come above all, right? Like even if I live here, I don't have the right to separate myself from my community. So I'm accountable to them first and always, and I try to keep it fresh.
Thank you. Yes, I cannot imagine you ever being boring in a meeting that you hold. And Ms. Raya, to close us out, how can we make this a space that's more inviting and welcoming to communities?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say, like, snaps up to the don't be boring. Like, I almost was just going to be like, don't be boring. Like, just like what Maria said. And I do think that we need, again, more investment in public education, public engagement. Like, we need the states, governments to do more of that. Another thing is that, and this is what I say, I try, that if folks can stop being afraid of community engagement, like stop being afraid of like, what does it mean to kind of like open up the box and like, let's just go ahead and talk about this. One of my sell points is that we are actually in an era of relative abundance in terms of having, federal funds to play with, state funds to play with, different things happening. Like, and I try to tell folks that, say our local municipality, if you engage the community on this, not only will you be doing the right thing, but you're going to get a better outcome. You're going to get a better outcome. And so let's not be afraid of doing this. Let's not be afraid of the data. Let's go ahead and embrace this process. And we will, in this era of relative abundance, and we'll get better outcomes. That's my sell. I mean, I try and sell that. And don't be boring.
Don't be boring. I think if we don't walk away with anything else here today, I'm sure we've thrown a lot of words at you. A lot of words have been thrown at you over these 3 days. And again, in our final day, we all know how important this is. We don't need to sell each other on that. So let's just go out there. Don't be boring. I'll see you guys in the next session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
If I come over there, can they see me? Where can they? Yeah, where they can
All
see
right.
me if I come.
I'm a log off. All
Likewise.
power to all the people. Talk
Take
to y'all
care. Good
later.
seeing y'all.
Thank you, Lily.
Good
Thank you.
seeing you.
It's okay. I'll message them. Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. But I'll do it via email. All right. Yeah, this is a very Naomi session. We don't stay too long.